Introduction. Peter Gelderloos is an American anarchist who argues against the utility of non-violent resistance to authority. The introduction of his most famous work, the book How Non-Violence Protects the State, says this, quote, "This book will show that non-violence, in its current manifestations, is based on falsified histories of struggle. It has implicit and explicit connections to white people's manipulations of the struggles of people of color. Its methods are wrapped in authoritarian dynamics, and its results are harnessed to meet government objectives over popular objectives. It masks and even encourages patriarchal assumptions and power dynamics. Its strategic options invariably lead to dead ends, and its practitioners delude themselves on a number of key points." End quote. This video summarizes a number of arguments contesting Gelderloos' claims, presenting evidence that his case against non-violent resistance fails, covering these topics. 1. The failure of Gelderloos. 2. Violence as a malleable solid. 3. Engaging with the opposition. 4. Criteria and histories. 5. Activist sources. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Please note that I did not write this script. It was submitted to me by one of the members of my Discord server who requested I convert it into a video. However, I do agree with the argument made here. See the link in the video description if you wish to join my Discord server and submit scripts of your own. The failure of Gelderloos. The question of violence and non-violence within anarchism has been one that's been active since Enrico Malatesta wrote that it was a necessary evil. David Graeber, Direct Action and Ethnography, writes that this can be attributed to the position of prefiguration common within anarchism and its contest with a social revolution. Prefiguration is the practice of implementing future goals into today's world. For example, if one wished to be in a society where racial minorities were not oppressed, one could start by respecting and treating those minorities as equals. In the context of anarchism, prefiguration is especially present when it comes to discussing how to reach a stateless society with those who advocate for utilizing the state for this goal, where the anarchist would ask how it makes sense to achieve statelessness using the state, which is supposed to be something that is to be gone in a stateless society. Graeber explains that this logic works naturally towards the question of violence. Since anarchists want a society without war or violence, it would make sense that one must not practice violence. However, Graeber points out that to many anarchists, the pervasiveness of capitalism and the state seem as if a violent social revolution is necessary. This kind of conflict is what has characterized most of the discussion between pacifism and anarchism. Peter Gelderloos, the author of How Non-Violence Protects the State and The Failure of Non-Violence, is one anarchist who has dedicated a portion of his writing and activism to the question of non-violence. His books on the subject have become popular among modern anarchist communities as arguments against pacifism, showcasing that it is ineffective and thus bigoted to assert the position. This is helped by the fact that he is also the author of Anarchy Works, a book that answers common questions regarding anarchism with real-life examples, which is also well known between anarchists. The lack of critique of his claims and arguments on non-violence contributes to the atmosphere of validity in Gelderloos' work. Those who have criticized Gelderloos' first book on non-violence have been given close to no attention, and there seems to be only 2 reviews focusing on critiquing the second book printed online. With the capability of the internet to spread works and repeat quotes from them like wildfire, these criticisms of nonviolence have been approximate to the most common position of anarchists regarding the question of nonviolence, with what appears to be not even a peep from others. It is because of this minimal criticism and wide praise, however, that many valid criticisms of Gelderloos' claims, arguments, and overall presentation are overlooked. The focus of this paper will be on the second book, The Failure of Non-Violence, as there is a severe lack of criticism compared to his first book, which does not amount to much in the first place. In the second book, Gelderloos relies on a lot of unreliable sources and evidence, if he uses sources at all in certain points, and his discussion about pacifist figures and non-violent movements are wholly misrepresentative. This is shown in how he talks about violence, important figures in pacifism, and empirical data that goes against his line of thought, where he demonstrates most plainly severe errors in the way he researches for this book. Along with his weaknesses, this paper will address certain concerns he finds critical for pacifism, demonstrating that pacifism is still worthy of consideration when talking about activism, that there are successes that can be attributed to non-violence, and that the theories behind it are coherent. All the page numbers cited from this point on will be from the version of The Failure of Nonviolence published on the Anarchist Library, unless written otherwise. Combined with a lack of critique, it is essential to critique Gelderloos' work, as he is still highly influential within anarchism to this day when discussing non-violence, even though the second edition of How Non-Violence Protects the State was published in 2007. Gelderloos, in The Failure of Nonviolence, cites his main arguments in the introduction as criticisms that pacifists have not yet addressed, page 7, showing that he still stands by these arguments to this day. It becomes an imperative for radicals who are interested in seeing non-violence become a more common method of activism, then, to address these arguments levied by Gelderloos and to see whether pacifism and non-violence still stand their ground. This paper is an attempt to levy a critical pacifist lens, rather than Kuhn's non-pacifist lens, on the failure of non-violence and to determine whether there is a genuine concern brought to the discussion. Violence as a malleable solid. In Chapter 1, Violence Doesn't Exist, Gelderloos makes the case that violence, as a term, is a useless one for analysis. It is loaded with moral qualities that were created by and are ultimately in favour of the powerful. Thus, to use it within one's own analysis is to have, quote, fallen into the trap, end quote, page 15, to give credence to categories created by the powerful that are then used against the powerless. First is the claim that violence does not have an agreed upon constant definition. Gelderloos first proposes that violence is a social construct. It is not a tangible object that one can grab and analyse, but rather is a concept made by humans that can differ in its application. His support for this comes from him asking people in workshops on non-violence about what they understand as violence, which was done by giving them various situations like, quote, a person killing someone trying to rape them, end quote, quote, carrying a gun in public, end quote, quote, paying your taxes, end quote, and, quote, driving a car, end quote, page 12. In his experience, what people described as violent depended on the groups they were in. For example, those who are in college don't see paying taxes as violent, and advocates for small farmers and rainforest protection would see soy factory production as violent, page 13. Gelderloos also extends the question of what is violent to natural disasters, asking if it is violent if a predator eats prey, or what, quote, the relationship between this fear of violence and a fear of the naturalness and inevitability of harm and death, end quote, page 13, implies for pacifism. After this, he then questions the validity of defining violence as, quote, causing harm, end quote, asking if participating in involuntary systems that cause harm would count those participating as violent, as if it did, then it would, quote, make a joke of non-violence, end quote, page 14, as it would present those passively acting in these systems as non-violent compared to those trying to change it. After all of this pondering, Gelderloos concludes that non-violence, being unable to understand violence as an objective thing, is not really about being rid of violence. Rather, it is, quote, an attempt to resolve, transform, or suppress those things in our society and in our social movements that appear to its practitioners to be violent, end quote, page 14. As Gelderloos claims, pacifists focus on eliminating obvious forms of violence, such as dictatorships and open war, but downplay more subtle forms of violence, like patriarchy or capitalism. Gelderloos then concludes the discussion on defining violence as such, quote, violence is so vague, so hard to define, it is useless as a strategic category. It would be silly to abolish it as a word, because it can succinctly describe a certain emotional reality. But to use it analytically, to use it as a guiding criterion for our strategies of struggle, is an invitation to confusion. It can take hours of debating, and only sometimes will a group of people agree to a common definition of violence. But they have accomplished nothing, because some of them will still not be convinced whether non-violent lines up with good, and violent with bad, as they are intended to. In other words, they still will not have learned anything about the proper methods for struggle. And more importantly, nearly everyone else in the world will still be using another definition, end quote, page 15. After this exposition, Gelderloos then questions where this, quote, category of violence, end quote, page 15, came from. To this he answers that the media is the origin, as it constantly restricts and limits the scope of movements, and being accused as violent is one of many added to the list. He connects this to the moral panics of the 19th and 20th centuries to expose violence as a euphemism for fear from the ruling class of a movement that challenges them and their systems, ignoring their own violence. When activists started taking this euphemism seriously, the ruling class could then determine what movements were more suited towards their favour, and thus, quote, the category of violence belongs to them, end quote, page 16. Gelderloos, after leaving the definition of violence to the elite, thus absolves himself from the claim that he advocates for violence. Instead, he sets his focus on a diversity of tactics broadly and, if necessary, quote, illegal, combative, conflictive, or forceful actions, end quote, page 17. Before criticism is levied, one should acknowledge that the media does play an influential role in characterizing how movements function in the eyes of the general public. In fact, it is enough of a boilerplate point within radical spheres that the phrase, quote, manufacturing consent, end quote, is as popular of a shorthand to refer to this phenomena as is the book that coined the phrase, Manufacturing Consent, by Noam Chomsky. Pacifists certainly don't disagree either, as it is a common point that non-violent movements can counter narratives that paint a negative image toward them in order to bring about more awareness and thus more support. Omar Massoud, 2020, also demonstrates when activists take advantage of the media, allowing them to seed certain opinions and influence how the news reports movements, using the civil rights movement as an example. Where the conflict comes in then is whether violence as a term is useful for activists and theorists to use. As one reads the first chapter, it may strike as peculiar the idea that violence is something that cannot be defined. In a sense, Gelderloos is right. To give a strict definition to violence that everyone follows is a futile effort. This analysis is not unique, since this is the case with any word in the human language. Kojokaru et al. 2012 demonstrate language's ability to shift and create perceived realities, and thus the varied understanding of language in the context of organizations, using a methodology informed by social constructionism to see how members view their organization via metaphors, and then to motivate those members. Even acknowledging this, then, should not affect our discussion of violence. Even Gelderloos agrees with this when discussing the term revolution, page 19. As Kuhn explains in his essay, quote, when we say, for example, be careful when arguing with John, he can get violent, we pretty much all know what that means. If John doesn't like what we say, he might smash our nose in. When we speak of a less violent society, we speak of an end to domestic abuse, gun killings, fistfights at the county fair, and so forth. I think we also have a pretty common understanding of what it means to have violent parents, a violent partner, to grow up in a violent neighborhood, or to fall victim to a violent crime, end quote. This is only a small concession, however. Joseph Llewellyn, an anarcho-pacifist, gives a Gandhian definition of violence as the restriction of human flourishing, envisioning an anarcho-pacifist peace, page 28, which he compares to the definition of Johann Galtung, a peace theorist, as, quote, avoidable impairment of fundamental human needs, or, to put it in more general terms, the impairment of human life which lowers the actual degree to which someone is able to meet their needs below that which would otherwise be possible, end quote. Kulturelle Gewalt, page 106. The World Health Organization also defines it as, quote, the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation, end quote. World Report on Violence and Health, page 5. Erica Chenoweth, a social scientist that Gelderloos focuses on in a later chapter, defines it in Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, as, quote, an action or practice that physically harms or threatens to physically harm another person, page 145. And in Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, they list examples of violent tactics like, quote, bombings, shootings, kidnappings, physical sabotage, such as the destruction of infrastructure, and other types of physical harm of people and property, end quote, page 27. To give up the goal in reclaiming our ability to analyse the world and concede to the ruling class seems weak for an anarchist to do, ever so dedicated to reclaiming many parts of life that have been forgotten under hierarchy. The credit of the category of violence to the media also seems weak, as this would not explain why Leo Tolstoy was a staunch advocate for pacifism in late 19th century Russia, before the kind of media as covered in Manufacturing Consent would have been common. One may mention that although we have given definitions that do work, they all do still differ in terms of where they come from. Many definitions of violence come from a pragmatic non-violent lens, where Llewellyn takes inspiration from Gandhi, and the WHO define it in the context of public health. We have already conceded that the definitions of words, and thus of violence, can already vary from person to person. Would it, then, be arguing over an anthill of differences on whether violence can be defined? In objection to this, one would understand better the issue of defining violence if we take definitions of words not as something to vary drastically from person to person, but rather to have variations around a base idea, not unlike malleable solids like gold or aluminium. Although the specific formulation of the definition and the ideological background of it can vary, we can still note a general sphere of ideas that take up violence, namely intentionality, harm, and barring others from experiencing a fuller life than one would experience without this harm. This should be a reasonable base to build our understanding of violence, and thus non-violence, on. Gelderloos also implies that non-violence can only work within a legal framework that is friendly to states, as indicated by replacing violence as a term with tactics that are illegal or forceful. What this ignores is that non-violent resistance is often quite forceful and even illegal at certain points. Barbara Deming, a radical pacifist and feminist, says, quote, "To refuse one's cooperation is to exert force. One can, in fact, exert so much force in this way that many people will always be quick to call non-cooperation violent," end quote. On Revolution and Equilibrium. As Chenoweth further explains, quote, "Non-violent resistance is deliberately disobedient, acting outside of existing institutions, laws, and larger systems that have become widely viewed as unjust or illegitimate. Civil resistance often works to openly challenge, contest, undermine, subvert, divide, or replace such institutions. Voting, holding campaign rallies, writing and collecting petitions, lobbying, calling one's member of Congress, and organizing legal advocacy campaigns are typically not considered civil resistance, since all of these actions occur within the system," end quote. Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, page 3. We encounter more linguistic issues with the fact that after the dispense of violence as a term, Gelderloos still uses the word non-violence to refer to the body of work dedicated to it. By still referring to it as a strategy, method of activism, or form of analysis, in the form of pacifism, he still operates under the same violence-non-violence binary he claims to reject. Non-violence implies having an understanding of what it is against by virtue of the non-prefix, namely violence, and an understanding of the attention that violence and non-violence have gained over time. Otherwise, what is Gelderloos writing about? In fact, one of the chapters in this book is titled "How the Peaceful Can Benefit from Violence," page 172. In it, Gelderloos explains that, quote, "Even those who believe they do not like violence benefit from the more dynamic space that is created when a diversity of tactics is at play," end quote, page 172. Another important point is that, quote, "diversity of tactics," end quote, does not really point to anything concrete. Every sensible activist will agree that sticking specifically to one tactic is a death wish. Non-violent activists agree as well, but they only differ in wanting to use non-violent tactics. As Kuhn explains, quote, "Unless a movement is really exclusively non-violent, are there that many? The non-violent tactics are a part of the puzzle of a diversity of tactics, and the relevant question would then be which role they play in this patchwork and how they relate to other tactics." But to say that a diversity of tactics works better than the dogmatic use of one particular tactic is a bit of a no-brainer and puts us back to square one. Which tactics, or which combination of tactics, are the most effective in a specific historical situation, end quote. It seems that Gelderloos is avoiding the term violence, not as a product of deep analysis, but rather to avoid the negative connotations of violence or advocating for violence. Gelderloos recognizes such connotations when he dedicates most of the text to the negative connotations of the term and how the media takes advantage of it. Diversity of tactics, then, could provide an avenue for Gelderloos to avoid this problem of perception as it dispenses with the negative connotations. It appears more neutral, more professional, and more ambiguous. Thus, it allows Gelderloos to avoid saying that he advocates for violence. The discussion that Gelderloos has about non-violence, however, betrays this hidden goal. Throughout this book and the last book, Gelderloos argues against non-violence as a method and implies, if not outright exclaiming, that violence is a necessary condition in order to overthrow the state. It is as if, although Gelderloos has painted his gold grey, the makeup of the actual solid is still gold. Although he holds to a diversity of tactics to open up avenues for activism, his arguments still point to the direction of advocating for violence primarily, if not only. Engaging with the opposition. A criticism of the last book, as given by Shabu Katir, Why Pacifists Aren't as Bad as Peter Gelderloos Says They Are, page 3, is that Gelderloos had not sufficiently engaged with pacifist literature. This allegedly led him down to making strawmen of pacifism that would not have been made otherwise. In this book, Gelderloos aims to meet this standard by engaging with, quote, those individuals who have been most influential, either on a world scale or domestically, in spreading the exclusive insistence on non-violent tactics or in providing a functioning example of non-violent action, end quote, page 101. He also focuses specifically on Gene Sharp and Erica Chenoweth, the latter of which this paper touches on in the next section. Before one engages with specific criticisms of any list of pacifist figures, one should take a look at the list that the critic has created, which Gelderloos' table of contents provides. The first target of Chapter 8 is Gene Sharp. This is understandable since, excluding someone like Gandhi or MLK, he is the most influential theorist of non-violence to date. If one wanted to go to school to study movements and organizing, Sharp would almost inevitably be mentioned. However, with the US military as the next example of pacifism, Gelderloos soon demonstrates a lack of familiarity with pacifist literature simply by what he showcases as influential pacifists. One would hope that Gelderloos picked theorists or activists like A.J. Must, David Dellinger, Barbara Deming, Brian Martin, or Bill Sutherland. Instead, many of those he chooses are either influential for other reasons or are just simply not pacifist in the case of the US military. In fact, in the first footnote for Chapter 8, he mentions that there are those, quote, who deserve mention, such as George Lakely, Helen Woodson, or Roy Bourgeois, end quote, page 101, but he doesn't want to give an exhaustive list. A hint of a better reason why Gelderloos does not list these people can be gleaned from his description of pacifists in the introduction. Quote, most proponents of non-violence have been smarter, and they have avoided any level playing field. They have not chosen the terrain of the movement itself because collective experiences repeatedly prove them wrong. Instead, they have turned towards the elite and gotten support from the system itself. Mainstream, for-profit publishing companies print out their books by the millions in a stream of titles that increases as competitive social movements gain more ground. Mainstream for-profit media give non-violent activists interviews while they demonize the so-called violent ones. University professors and NGO employees living off of grants from the government or wealthy donors also tend to weigh in on the side of non-violence, bringing a hefty array of institutional resources along with them. End quote. Page 9. Consider Woodson, who was arrested with 3 other activists in 1984 for damaging the concrete lid over a silo made for Operation Plowshare as an act against nuclear weapons for the silo pruning hooks. Consider Lakey, who is not only a veteran of the civil rights movement, but also was a founding member of Movement for a New Society, which went on to become a supremely influential organization for the New Left. Another important thing to note as well is that none of the people mentioned in the footnote are NGO employees or university professors, published by mainstream publishers, or platformed by mainstream news networks. These are bona fide activists that have continued advocating for non-violence since the late 20th century. Another is that these 3, in Gelderloos' words, quote, have faced grave consequences for their commitment to non-violence, end quote, page 101, and have seen little recognition from broader society. In short, these are radical pacifists. This is in comparison to people like Gene Sharp or Mark Kurlansky, who are a general nonviolent advocate and a liberal pacifist, respectively. What Gelderloos has done is actively exclude radical pacifists from his analysis and instead focus on the most obvious targets or those that he personally dislikes. From this, it would almost feel like a betrayal to critical analysis and activism to engage with the list. Why would someone entertain another's interpretation of the most influential pacifists if those listed are among the most peculiar people to consider influential? Radical pacifists would be activists most affected by Gelderloos' criticism. Their attacks of capitalism from a non-violent lens would give Gelderloos enough literature to build a critique of pacifism from an activist perspective. Thus, it is an utter weakness to instead focus on pacifists who are not focused on overturning capitalism. Despite these concerns, this paper will focus on the section on the old school and Gene Sharp, along with chapters 4 and 5, where Sharp and his theories are also discussed. The section on the old school, the term given by Gelderloos to Christian pacifists, is the shortest line of criticism and thus will be approached first. Gelderloos attacks them on the basis that their direct action is, quote, no more than charity reproducing pre-existing power inequalities, end quote, and that they largely, quote, have ended up as the reclusive, eccentric and embarrassing uncle of the non-violence family, end quote, abandoned by the larger movement because they, quote, suffer from a long-standing lack of strategy, end quote, page 132. One would be inclined to treat this section as largely an oddity, as Gelderloos had previously considered these movements in a positive light, even calling the Catholic worker communities and Tolstoyan communities both anarchist successors. They were presented as examples that humans aren't naturally warlike in Gelderloos' book Anarchy Works, page 23. Gelderloos goes even further to discuss how each of these communities protested their respective states, implying that their strategy was more fleshed out than he says in The Failure of Nonviolence. Going into chapter 4, and thus his thoughts on Gene Sharp, one should note that Gelderloos runs through the hidden assumption that nonviolence relies on changing minds. This is explicitly mentioned in How Nonviolence Protects the State, when he says, quote, nonviolence focuses on changing hearts and minds, end quote, page 59. And in this book, when he says, quote, the primary flaw in a majority of nonviolent discourses is to view revolution as a morality play, end quote, page 20. However, it also relies on the assumption that it requires to specifically change the mind of the media and the ruling class. Speaking of the colour revolutions, Gelderloos says, quote, in every single colour revolution, the movement had a large proportion of the domestic elite on their side from the beginning. This includes rich people, the owners of the mass media, opposition political parties, academics, religious authorities, and so on. No military organisation in the world is going to open fire on protesters who are supported by the country's business elite, end quote, page 64. By attributing this to Sharp's strategies and saying, quote, the unwritten part of Gene Sharp's method, reliance on businessmen, international media, and powerful governments, is the only thing causing an impact, end quote, page 69, Gelderloos makes the primary mistake of misunderstanding nonviolence, particularly from Gene Sharp. In fact, in From Dictatorship to Democracy, this result of nonviolence, what Sharp calls conversion, is, quote, the least likely, end quote, and, quote, in most conflicts, this does not occur at all, or at least not on a significant scale, end quote. From Dictatorship to Democracy, page 35. Sharp has also warned against taking money from government apparatuses like the CIA, saying it could make a movement dependent on a source of income that could suddenly withdraw at any point. Why would someone whose strategy secretly relied on gaining sympathy from the elite constantly advocate against relying on funds from governments and say that conversion is the least likely outcome of a non-violent movement? It doesn't help that many claims made about the colour revolutions by Gelderloos are left uncited, leaving the room for further discussion closed off without any base to go off. A strange comment is made by Gelderloos regarding the overthrow of President Joseph Estrada, leading into a discussion about the democratic qualities of non-violence. Quote, to its credit, this method did lead to people in the Philippines overthrowing another unpopular government in 2001, though this lack of respect for democratic process that the use of disruptive mass protest evidently inculcates should be most embarrassing to Mr. Sharp, who holds democratic government as the highest good. When Filipinos used the methods of the Yellow Revolution to oust then-President Joseph Estrada, many international and domestic critics regarded the 2001 movement as a form of mob rule and alleged a conspiracy among top politicians, business leaders, and military and church officials. With regards to non-violent methodology, several questions arise that must be dealt with. If non-violent regime change is best suited to achieving democracy, how can it be that the same method also tramples basic democratic principles like due process? If it is democratic to oust fraudulently elected dictators using mass protests and obstruction, but a de facto coup to oust an unpopular, corrupt, but elected and impeachable president using those same methods, what is the line between dictatorship and democracy? The answer to all of these questions is in fact simple, but not within the framework of Gene Sharp." End quote. Page 62. This leads to more misunderstandings regarding the content and purpose of Sharp's theories. Similar misunderstandings are presented in Chapter 8, when Gelderloos says that From Dictatorship to Democracy has, quote, "no critique of political parties," end quote, or, quote, "no criticism of capitalism," end quote. Page 103. The book is not meant to be a political thesis dedicated to answering questions about the worth of democracy and why non-violent movements are and should be democratic. Sharp had largely avoided giving a distinct political body to his non-violent strategy. As Rory Arrow, director of How to Start a Revolution, which was dedicated to Sharp, explains, quote, "It's perfectly possible to use Sharp's work to fight for a communist utopia or an Islamic fundamentalist state if you so wished. There is an assumption that democracy is a good thing. That's not neoliberal, it's just liberal and democratic," end quote. He elaborates, quote, "Sharp is not prescriptive about the type of government which might come after a successful non-violent resistance campaign. What he does say is that there must be a vision of tomorrow, but it's for the people to decide what form that government takes. If he had been prescriptive about the type of government, the books would not be nearly as successful across different states, religions, and cultures as it has been. The form of government Muslim activists in Sudan might seek is likely to be radically different from those in Ukraine. The idea that Sharp would be able to prescribe an ideal form of government for an array of countries and cultures, or for one single form that could fit all, is ridiculous. The people decide," end quote. Relating again to accusations on the character of Sharp, Gelderloos goes on to claim that Sharp was funded by the government. He refers to Stephen Zuhn's article in Huffington Post in defense of Sharp, claiming that, quote, "buried in a single paragraph in the middle of his 42-paragraph article," end quote, page 64, he admits that the Albert Einstein Institute, an organization dedicated to non-violence founded by Sharp, was funded by partisan NGOs, and that Sharp was funded by the Defense Department. Gelderloos concludes that, quote, "these allegations are not so false after all," end quote, page 64. This is a misrepresentation of what Zuhn actually said in the article. To quote from the relevant paragraph, quote, "well prior to the Bush administration coming to office, AEI received a couple of small grants from the congressionally funded National Endowment for Democracy and the International Republican Institute to translate some of Gene Sharp's theoretical writings. Nearly 40 years ago, and 15 years prior to AEI's founding, Sharp received partial research funding for his doctoral dissertation from Harvard professor Thomas Schelling, who had received support from the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the US Department of Defense to fund doctoral students," end quote. This indicates that the connections of Sharp to the government are tenuous at best. They are largely small funding initiatives that could not reasonably link someone conclusively to the government. Arrow further elaborates, quote, "his work in the 60s, 70s, and 80s wasn't focused on democracy groups bringing down directors, which is the focus today, but on preventing a nuclear war. Sharp believed that by training ordinary people to non-violently resist an occupation, as the Norwegians had in Norway during World War II, they could make the costs of a Russian occupation of Western Europe so difficult that it would act as a deterrent to invasion equal to that of mutually assured destruction. He realized that simply protesting for peace was weak and unlikely to produce change, so he actively pursued contact with the most influential figures in the defense establishment, both in the UK and the US. His aim was to have non-violent resistance written into official defense policy by governments, believing that this was the best way to avoid nuclear war. He wanted to replace violent weapons with non-violent defence where possible, end quote. Gelderloos goes on to criticise Sharp's proposition of civilian-based defence to avoid requiring a strong military, only commenting that, quote, non-violence is a complement to the military, not a replacement, end quote, page 103. This shows yet again a lack of engagement with Sharp's work, in this case not going further with analysing Sharp's civilian-based defence, a post-military defence system, an interpretation of decades of work that can only be interacted with if one completely accepts Gelderloos' grounds. If Gelderloos had wished to engage with a pacifist that did criticise centralisation and capitalism, or engage with social defence as a replacement for the military, then it would seem ridiculous to not engage with Brian Martin's anarcho-pacifist literature, who has put in a portion of his writing to social defence, including a dedicated chapter in Uprooting War, page 21. Criteria and histories. Erika Chenoweth and Maria Stefan are two social scientists most famous for their studies on nonviolence and its effects on the success of movements. They became known through a paper and book by the same name, Why Civil Resistance Works, which showed that nonviolent movements succeeded twice as often as violent movements in goals including regime change and national liberation. If accurate, this means disastrous consequences for Gelderloos' main assumption that non-violence is ineffective in activism, in fact showing that violence was significantly more ineffective. Understandably then, Gelderloos addresses Chenoweth's work in Chapter 3, The Revolutions of Today, page 24, along with creating an analysis of post-Cold War movements and whether they succeeded, page 29. The criticism of Chenoweth starts with what determines the success of a movement. Gelderloos claims that they don't use, quote, revolutionary criteria, end quote, page 25, to determine success, instead counting reformist movements like the colour revolutions as successes. This presents itself as if claiming this is an issue makes it an issue. Gelderloos has failed to establish why revolutionary criteria is necessary for understanding whether a movement is successful or not. Along with this, Gelderloos claims that Chenoweth does not define violence or give an original study of each of the movements they reference. He recounts how, quote, after extensive searching, I was unable to find original narratives of the movements used by Chenoweth, end quote, page 25. This is where the reader might realise that instead of referencing the book, published 2 years before the failure of non-violence, Gelderloos has been referring to the paper, instead printed 5 years before the failure of non-violence. This is strange for a book 6 years in the making to do, since he otherwise references in footnotes events that have happened in 2012, page 6, just a year before the publication of this book. This becomes even more concerning as the 2011 book from Chenoweth addresses the exact concerns brought up by Gelderloos in page 27 and in an online appendix, respectively. The reason for Gelderloos referring to the paper, other than Gelderloos perhaps just not being aware of the book's existence, is not discernible. Gelderloos then goes on to say that because he disagrees with experts on classifying movements like the civil rights movement or the Indian independence movement as non-violent rather than utilising a diversity of tactics, then, quote, we can only assume that many of successful non-violent campaigns on the list included armed and combative elements, end quote, page 25. This represents a flaw that Martin wrote about in his book of the last book from Gelderloos on non-violence, How Non-Violence is Misrepresented, page 242. Gelderloos criticises attributing the success of a varied movement to non-violence, but then goes on to attribute the success to violence. If a movement was truly a diversity of tactics, why would one not avoid giving the credit of the entire movement to either side? It also represents Gelderloos' ability again to assert claims as if stating them makes them true. He has not actually given proof to show that most of the movements listed as non-violent successes were really those which used a diversity of tactics. Gelderloos then claims that Chenoweth contradicts their own research, saying Chenoweth, quote, commits the most basic error in statistics, confusing correlation with causation to say that an armed wing can reduce popular participation, end quote, even though her own data do not support this assertion, end quote. Please note that although Gelderloos uses she/her pronouns for Chenoweth, Chenoweth uses gender-neutral pronouns. It's possible Gelderloos was simply unaware of this, or that Chenoweth made the change after Gelderloos published his work. Gelderloos cites the article Armed Wing in Syria to what effect to support his claim, but reading the article shows he gave a disingenuous presentation of it. The relevant excerpt in question is this, quote, "In sum, having an armed wing is risky, but not necessarily decisive. The armed wing won't help the non-violent movement in Syria. However, as long as the movement remains mainly non-violent in nature, the campaign may succeed regardless." End quote. Chenoweth in this excerpt does not say that an armed wing can't affect participation, but rather that as long as it does not make up a majority of the movement, then it will not affect it. After critiquing Chenoweth, Gelderloos sets out to create his own analysis in the style of Chenoweth. Gelderloos wants to compare radical movements, quote, "with clear criteria and without double standards," end quote, page 55, while moving past the usual, supposedly flawed criteria of success, that is, did the movement achieve its goals? Gelderloos gives 4 criteria. 1. Quote, "whether a movement succeeds in seizing space in which new relations can be put in practice," end quote, page 28. Gelderloos clarifies that new relations refers to processes like common ownership and non-hierarchical decision-making. 2. Quote, "to what extent a movement spreads awareness of its ideas," end quote, page 28. Gelderloos clarifies that the information must be expressed as something worth fighting for rather than as passive information. 3. Quote, "whether a movement has elite support," end quote, page 28. Gelderloos is concerned with recuperation of radical movements into reformist actions, something that he claims is more common in non-violent movements, page 22. He also says this can demonstrate whether the state wants us to be violent or non-violent. 4. Quote, "did a movement achieve any concrete gains that improve people's lives?" End quote, page 28. He excludes reformist gains like transitioning into democracy as, quote, "this is a redundant victory that can only matter to those who have allowed themselves to believe that democratic government is somehow analogous to freedom or a better life," end quote, page 28. Using these criteria, Gelderloos goes on to analyse 30 movements from the 1990s to the 2010s, determining whether they were violent or non-violent, and where they lie on the list offered by Gelderloos. He comes to the conclusion that non-violent movements, quote, "have not succeeded in redistributing power in any meaningful way or putting revolutionary social relations into practice despite claiming victory numerous times," end quote, page 56. And that, quote, "a diversity of tactics have been the most effective at seizing space and putting new social relations into practice," end quote, page 56. The first issue with this section comes from the criteria. Criteria like number 4 are hard to actually properly quantify. What does it mean to improve someone's life? And other criteria would be impossible to determine without first-hand experience in each of the movements, a credential Gelderloos cannot possibly have. The declaration that democratic reform doesn't count as an improvement with regard to criteria 4, even going so far as to say, quote, "the line between democracy and dictatorship is fictitious," end quote, page 65, is a ridiculous statement as well. Robert Dahl, a political scientist who has written extensively about democracy, has described many benefits of democratic governments, including greater personal freedom and no war among democracies. Balia et al. 2009 and O'Neill and Russett 1999 confirmed Dahl's claim that democracy causes less war. Writing in the context of African politics, Democracy Works, Rewiring Politics to Africa's Advantage, demonstrates that democracies provide greater economic benefit and have a self-correcting mechanism, page 17, citing the transition away from Jacob Zuma in South Africa as an example for the latter claim. It has also been proven that democratic institutions help the environment, Winslow 2005, and benefit public health, Safai 2006. The difference between democracy and dictatorship isn't simply, quote, "primarily one of formalism and ritual," end quote, page 65. There are real, distinct benefits just from even a state being democratic, which gives hope for anarchism to adopt democratic institutions without a state. Another issue, perhaps more damning, is that throughout the 30 movements he analyses and the 26 pages he dedicates to this analysis, he has only 7 sources, all of them being quotes. This leaves a clear vulnerability in the potential of his understanding of movements to be refuted. For example, he claims that the Zapatistas, an existing indigenous army in Chiapas, Mexico that was founded in 1994 as a reaction to NAFTA, utilizes a diversity of tactics, page 30. However, Evans, 2009, explains that they have been largely non-violent, and some Comandante Marcos, the public face of the Zapatistas, has said that the Zapatistas have been explicitly non-violent since 2006. Graeber also writes in Direct Action, an ethnography from 2008, that, quote, it's something of an open secret that for the last 5 years at least, the Zapatistas have not even been carrying real guns, end quote, page 184. Gelderloos also claims that the 15M movement failed after riots broke out in 2012 because pacifists had launched a campaign against activists who participated in riots, page 49, without a source to support this claim. However, Munoz and Anduiza, 2019, focus on a riot that happened within the 15M movement in 2016, showing that the riot reduced popular support for the movement significantly without the need of pacifists criminalizing the rioters. Another study, Simpson et al. 2018, confirmed that violent protest reduces popular support of a movement, using the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the anti-fascist response as a case study instead. Because of a severe lack of sources to discuss movements, this paper cannot say more on any of the movements mentioned by Gelderloos, despite the desire to engage more deeply in the conversation. Gelderloos would make his arguments significantly stronger by sourcing his claims, thus providing a basis on which people can discuss his interpretation of various subjects. Activist sources? A common theme this paper has touched on is the lack of sources used by Gelderloos. This criticism that is levied throughout this paper was also given to Gelderloos' first book, primarily by Katir. Although Gelderloos has seemed to recognize this, it is only to the extent that his historical references relied on too few references to violent movements. He writes, quote, another error in How Nonviolence Protects the State, I want to point out, is a shortcoming in the range of historical references. Reflecting a weakness in a large part of the anarchist movement at the time, both in which books anarchist publishers chose to print and which stories the rest of us chose to get excited about, in talking about certain struggles, I centered the focus on romanticized armed groups that saw themselves as the vanguard, end quote, page 182. In response to Katir, Gelderloos makes this comment regarding his historiography in How Nonviolence Protects the State, quote, the arguments I express in the book are based on countless debates, arguments, and conversations. If in SK's mind this makes me a bad historian, I, quite frankly, expletive, on their elitist concept of historiography, end quote. As a defense of Gelderloos, one might say that the lack of sources is not indicative of a lack of research, but rather demonstrates that Gelderloos relies on sources that cannot be neatly listed. Although reading large written works is a primary source for anarchist theory, mediums like videos on YouTube, essays published online, and audiobooks are also widely used, especially today. This also should include discussions and lessons from activism that one learns from, as Gelderloos points out in the comment above, which might be termed overall anarchist oral traditions. In fact, there are whole works dedicated to this kind of discussion between activists. Collections like the Oral History of the American Left collection in the Tamament Library and Robert F. Wagner Labor Archives at New York University have an abundance of anarchist oral history, and Anarchist Voices, An Oral History of Anarchism in America, is a book dedicated to the subject. It would not be improper, then, to assume that Gelderloos has done just as he said. He has learned of these movements and of the ramifications of nonviolence through his discussions with other activists like him. Although a convincing proposition, this falls flat. The problem is that there is not simply an engagement with nonviolence. Gelderloos regularly makes wide claims about pacifism, including a dive into what he considers to be pacifist literature and Chenoweth's peer-reviewed study, and has an analysis of over 30 movements of which he makes no mention of talking to other activists for most of these. Considering Gelderloos was born around the start of the 1980s and many of these movements are in different countries, it is unlikely that he was involved to a major degree with more than half of the movements mentioned. Because of this, there is an imperative for accurate and credible sources about the history of each movement and the description of pacifism. By engaging with scholars like Sharp and Chenoweth, there is even more of this pressure to give credible sources. One must then assume that the best solution to this is that if he did not cite credible sources or learn from discussions with activists from respective movements, he is engaged with activism in America and has learned from these experiences on the outcomes of pacifism. But even within his own books, his history of activism seems lacking. The most that is mentioned is the School of America Watch in How Nonviolence Protects the State, an organization that Gelderloos spends a good portion of the book critiquing. Other than that, in both books, we mostly see references to non-specific protests he was a part of and workshops that he taught. How should we trust the word of Gelderloos when by his own recount he does not seem experienced in activism? Conclusion. When civil war broke out in Spain during World War II, a collection of trade unions and popular militias teamed up to defend against Franco and the front of Spanish fascism using violence. Early on, they had shown impressive anarchist victories. They had a successful defense of Madrid in 1936, and places like Aragon and Catalonia provided the grounds for creating anarchist institutions, thus leading to the most cohesive attempt at an anarchist society in history. This, however, then came to a saddening end. They were eliminated by the communists in Spain in 1937, and the communists themselves were defeated by Franco. Combined with the hesitancy of siding with either the Allies or the Axis powers later on in World War II, anarchists soon started questioning the efficacy and legitimacy of violence, struggle, and war, leading to a radical exposition of the anti-war position. This would give breeding grounds to the first notable foundations of anarcho-pacifism. From this starting point, authors like Bart de Licht, who wrote The Conquest of Violence, would give anarcho-pacifism some of its most notable works. Decades of literature on radical pacifism would soon flourish through many ideological variances, from secular individualist anarchism to Christian and/or communist anarchism. It is a shame, then, that Gelderloos does not engage with this body of work at all. He doesn't have an excuse for it either, as many sources documenting radical pacifism have been up for years before and after the publishing of his two books. It seems that instead of directly engaging with pacifists that would be in a similar line of thought with Gelderloos, Gelderloos has focused on criticizing those he personally dislikes and then applying that to all of pacifism. The pacifists that he has engaged with only serve as a medium to show how unfamiliar he is with the arguments, thus being unfit to properly critique it. Pacifism has a large body of research to support itself. Apart from Sharp and Chenoweth, authors like Joseph Llewellyn, Brian Martin, and Michael Beer have been extensively advocating nonviolent research, and organizations like the War Resisters League have been keeping the radical pacifist spirit alive with documenting much of radical anti-war activism. The research shows consistently that nonviolent resistance is the most effective and justifiable form of activism, theoretically and empirically, and there have been plenty of books that teach activists how to do nonviolent activism. Because Gelderloos has not effectively addressed the claims of pacifism, this conclusion is left untouched.